Hey guys, Phil Baumhart here. So for today's video, I'll be making a sheath for my D-Guard Bowie knife. So since this is a replica of the Milledgeville Confederate Bowies, I've looked at the historic examples of the sheaths that were made for these type knives, and I want to try to make as accurate a replica as I can for this. So of all the knives found at the Milledgeville Arsenal, they all had a very similar construction as far as the sheath was concerned. So they were all a full leather scabbard with a top stitch construction, a reinforced mouth, some copper rivets to back up the stitching, and then a tin tip covering the end of the sheath. So my version isn't going to be exactly the same, but let me show you what I plan on doing. Okay, so here's the paper pattern that I made up for the knife. So this is about 8-ounce leather that I'm using here. I still need to cut out the welt. I got about a 1/2-inch welt. It'll be going around the protecting the edge, both the true and the false edge. And then for the throat of the scabbard, this is going to be some thinner leather that I have, so about 4 or 5 ounce leather, because this is going to wrap around the mouth of the sheath. And then there'll be a rivet going through here, and then probably 2 more here. The historical ones did a copper rivet up here, and then 2 pewter ones. I'm just going to be using copper for all the rivets on here. So for the belt loop of the sheath, I got a piece of 9-ounce leather. That's the thickest leather that I have right now, and on a lot of the historic examples that were actually carried, the belt loops ripped off, and then guys had the cut slits in here so they can weave their belt through, because the leather that they were using, the loops were just too thin. So I made sure that my loop 1 is broad enough to support the knife, and I'm going to have a lot of good stitching down here. Okay, so I got the belt loop piece of leather here, and so I'm going to burnish it up, and then we'll drill out the holes for sewing it onto the sheath itself. We're just going to wet down the edges with some warm water, and this is my birch branch burnishing wheel that I made. So with sheath making, you really got to kind of think ahead in steps, because if I just went and sewed this onto the sheath itself without doing the edges, I wouldn't be able to do that when it's attached to the sheath itself, so I have to do that now. So the edges are all nice and smooth right now, and so now I've got some beeswax, and so we're going to just burnish this up with a coating of beeswax to finish that off. Okay, so when it's all done, it's got a real smooth, slick feel. That's why it's called slicking the edges. And you can feel that kind of wax, that kind of stickiness. So that means it's sealed. And so it's got a real smooth feel. Okay, so now I'm going to drill out the holes into the scabbard itself. So this is meant to be worn on the left side, so the blade is going to be facing out, so that means that this side right here is where the belt loop is going to be attached. And so we're going to have our liner on the lip there, so this needs to go below that, probably right about there. So that's going to fold over, and then we'll drill it down just like that. So first we will drill out the holes here. So I think 2 banks of stitches should be sufficient. Line that back up again. So we fold that over right about there. Is where that will need to be. And we'll just drill that out. That strip of leather for the mouth of the sheath has dried. It doesn't really take very long to do that. So now I've left it long on purpose, because I know that when I fold this all over, it's gonna want to move around a little bit. What I want to do now is glue it up with some barge cement. And then once that glue sets, then I will drill some holes through to put some rivets on there. It's a thin bead, doesn't have to be too crazy. And then we'll get some on the outside here. Okay. So I got this barred cement because it's supposed to be good for leather. So like some holster makers use this specifically. So I thought I'd give it a shot. So we're going to clamp that on there. I'm going to try to use another piece of leather over this because I don't want to leave marks from my clamps themselves on the sheath itself. So hopefully that'll kind of protect it. Okay, we'll just let that glue set. Okay, so the mouth of the sheath is all glued up, so we can trim off our excess leather here. So on the historic Confederate D-Guard Bowie knives, they had one piece of tin that was wrapped around this end of the sheath and then soldered closed. Now I don't have tin, I don't have a soldering machine, so what I'm going to do instead, just to kind of protect this point area, is I'm going to put a little steel inlay on there, and that's just to keep the point of the knife from going through when you sheath the knife, because this is such a long sheath that if you're trying to put the knife into the sheath, if your sheath is bent or something like that, you don't want that fine point of the Bowie knife coming through your leather, and especially if you fall on this or something like that, you don't want the point of the knife coming through the sheath and poking you. So the steel is really just to kind of give you an added bit of protection, but really just to give it that kind of historic flair. Even though it is not historically accurate, this is kind of what I'm able to do with my current technology level. So, so I've got one piece already cut out. So what I'm going to do now is cut out the other piece, and this is some 22 gauge steel. This is scrap left over from my Norman helmet project, if you saw that video. So this is really thin steel, which actually makes it kind of a pain in the ass to cut out. And so I've just got a hacksaw and these diagonal cutters. This actually probably works the best for doing the fine work in the curve here. So I'll really quickly just show you how I cut these out. So on these straightaways, I usually take these down with the hacksaw. They still have the hacksaw still has a tendency to walk, so it can still be kind of difficult. You can see how that 22 gauge cuts really easy, but it's so thin it wants to bend around when it's put under pressure from the saw, so it really has to be held close to the vise. Okay, I'm going to put some cuts in here. Okay, so with those cuts, I'm able to come in with the diagonal cutters here. I'll just sort of pinch it and wiggle it back and forth, and that'll take it off. And for this steel, with the tools that I got, this is, believe it or not, the easiest method.
Okay, so here's what those steel pieces look like. I let them soak in vinegar for about a day and a half just to give them kind of a better patina. But before I attach these on, I'm going to put a couple of coats of oil onto the leather because I find that, well, one, putting a coat on the inside just sort of helps give the leather a interior finish, but it also helps give you a darker, richer color. So I've just got my regular linseed oil. Don't let the Windex bottle confuse you. And I like to get the raw linseed oil because it doesn't contain any petroleum products. I can just use my hand to apply it. I don't have to worry about getting sick. But if you have any holes drilled like this, it will soak in through the edges, and so those holes will be darker. So if that's what you want, that's a good thing. So you can see it's soaking in through the edges here, and that's all going dark. So this, when it dries, will actually be much lighter than it appears right now, and it'll all even out very quickly as well. So I'm going to put this on the outside as well as the interior. So the interior of the leather, that's going to soak up a lot more oil a lot more quickly. And so I also like to get the edges of the sheath as well, because again, those are going to soak it up, and then you'll actually get a darker finish on this outside portion. And just from an aesthetic standpoint, I just think that looks better. So we'll start putting it on the inside, just rubbing that all in, because you don't want to be looking into the inside of your sheath and just seeing the raw leather, the white leather. It doesn't look very good. So you can see almost in the time that it took me just to do the inside of the sheath here that the outside has just completely dried. Not dried, but the oil has soaked into the leather itself. You can see where it's darker around where I drilled the holes and darker around the edges. So with the oil, it's good to just do a lot of little coats. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'll do more coats after I put it together, but especially with the inside of the sheath, I just kind of like to get a head start doing it before I drill it all together. And I'll probably put a coat on after I drill the holes to sew it up. You can also use neatsfoot oil, but you know, I've got the linseed that I use on my knife handles and all that, so I have found that it works just as good on the leather. So another thing that I like to use on staining my leather sheaths is my homemade birch oil. And so especially with these white spots, we'll start applying it on here. And so this is really thick stuff, so you got to be careful about. I would definitely recommend rubbing it in as soon as possible, because it really thickens up, and you don't want to just leave it on there to dry, because then it gets all blotchy. So when it's warm, it tends to spread better. And what you can actually do is use linseed oil to it kind of cuts it and dilutes it. So I'll actually use the linseed oil to get it off my hands, because it's very difficult to get off your hands on its own. But you can see how it kind of has a mind of its own, and it's thicker and thinner in different places. But that's got to be the look that you're going for. You can see how it kind of spreads it out. So birch oil, to my understanding, was initially developed as a leather conditioner, a leather stain, and it was used on kind of luxury leather, so it was kind of a sign of quality if you used birch oil on your leather, because it has a very distinct odor, and that was something that they looked for, I guess. I don't actually know how they treated their leather sheaths for the Milledgeville Bowies, but I know they used a mixture that contained linseed oil for doing kind of like a black stain or a black finish on the actual D guards themselves, the knuckle guards. So it's possible they used linseed oil. Don't know. This is just sort of my version. This is what I like to do on my on any of my leather stuff. So you can see, you really gotta work it in to keep it from blotching up. But you get a darker brown color. The linseed oil on its own is really just sort of a russet red, which is nice looking all on its own. It just takes more coats to get it to a place that's
dark enough. Yeah, you can see that. Cutting the birch oil, spreading it around. Now, it doesn't take as long for birch oil to dry on the leather as it does on wood, but it is going to take longer than linseed oil. But just like any of these steps with knife making, you know, you got to put the time in, put the effort in, and it pays off. Okay, so we're just going to let that dry. Okay, so the leather is pretty much dry here. You can see how it's turning out. So before I sew it up, I'm going to put my little steel pieces on the end of the sheath here. So I'm going to be using my brass escutcheon pins. So we'll draw out the holes in the steel first, and then we'll put the holes in the leather. Okay, so now that we got the holes all drilled out in the steel, we can line it up on the leather and put the subsequent hole in the leather. So I gotta make sure I leave enough room for the welt. Okay, so we'll run our brass pin through. We'll snip it off with the diagonal cutters and then peen it over. So we'll lay it down there. Got a little ball peen hammer with a real fine peen on there. And just carefully tap it over. And I'm looking at that material, watching it go over. Switch over to the other side. What you don't want to do is use too heavy a hammer or too hard of blows, because then instead of mushrooming the brass over, you're just kind of smashing it and bending it over. And you don't need a lot of material for this peen. If you have too much material, if that brass is too long, it's easier just to bend it over. And so when you're done, it should be pretty flush to the leather, so it shouldn't scratch up the knife. I mean, because one, it's brass, but also it's really squashed down in there in the leather itself. Just flatten it out just to kind of get it started. And switching over to the peen here, just sort of trying to pull that material in all the different directions. Okay, so I got those all riveted down. So now I'm going to get this belt loop sewn on, and then I can put some glue down on the welt, and then glue this up before sewing it together. Okay, so we'll go ahead and sew on the belt loop. So we got to sew on this part first, and then we'll fold it over and sew on that. So what I like to use in all of my knife sheaths is bank line, and it's a tarred twine. So I don't know what they actually use in the Milledgeville knife sheath, but it is what I like to use. And then especially on the rest of the sheath itself, it's great because if you have a knife and you're in a survival situation, you can, you know, undo the sheath, or at least do half the sheath, because I'm double stitching these. You can undo half the sheath, you still have a usable knife sheath, but then you have some emergency cordage if you need it. And you can also pull apart the strands on this bank line as well. And for sewing it by hand, like I'm doing, I just find it easier to do than with the smaller needle and thread. When it starts getting tough to pull through, basically I'm on the second set of stitches. I'll use my Leatherman to pull that up. Okay, that should be the last one. So tie this off, fuse the end. Okay, now to do this end. Okay, so I went through this entire layer with a single stitch, so I just pulled it up through here, so now I'm going to double back the way I came and start going that way. So we'll go back to the central knot. So when I fused off this bank line, since it's got that tar, it'll actually burn and melt. I like to pinch off that burnt end with the pliers. Okay, so that's what the finished belt loop looks like. So now before I can glue it up, I need to make my welt. So here's my paper pattern, and you can see where I actually traced the outline of the knife before drawing out the design for the sheath itself. So I'm actually cut out on the line where the blade is, and then this material here will be my welt. So there's my welt all cut up. So now we'll get this glued up inside of here. Quick test fit right here. Okay, so that'll work. I'm just going to trim the edge of this here. That'll fit nicely. So once I get this all glued up, then I'll drill out the, then I will drill out my holes. So there's a little test fit of the knife. Had to clean out a little bit of the welt there, just to make sure it would fit properly. But now we're ready to glue up the other half here. So the sheath is all glued up now. So there's a few, it's not completely even everywhere. So I'm just going to take my knife here and just try to even everything up. And then once I got that done, I'll be able to drill out the holes to sew it up. And then I'll sew it up. So it didn't fully glue everywhere, but that's okay, because I really just wanted the glue on there to kind of be like a just to kind of hold together, so I could drill out the sewing holes, and I knew that everything would be even. I'm using one of these open L folding knives for this, because it's a very thin blade. So it seems to really glide through that leather well. The only times it hangs up is when I'm trying to cut through the glue. So I'm also going to use the work sharp just to kind of further neaten everything up. Okay, now before I can even drill those holes, there's a couple things I got to do. One is I want to neaten up the edge. So I've got a size 3 edge beveler from Tandy Leather, so I'm gonna clean up the edge here. Got a stitching groover to groove the piece so I know where to run my stitches. So the key with this is the right angle and maintaining firm, even pressure, and that way you get the whole string here. Because if you run at the wrong angle, especially with the super cheap one, it doesn't cut. It just sort of drags through the leather and is just a mess. There we go. Not bad. It's time to sew it up now, so I'll just follow the scribe line with the drill, and then we'll be able to sew it up. Okay, so for drilling this out, I like to use a 7/64 drill bit. That seems to work good with the bank line that I'm using. So with that thicker cordage like that, you know, if the hole is too small, it's really a bear to get through with that larger sail needle. So, and I don't have a you know, any sort of measurement trick or anything like that. I'm basically just eyeballing it. So you don't necessarily need to glue these up if you're just starting out with this. I usually use clamps on smaller projects with something this big. I really thought it best just to use that glue. So I'm drilling it out on the face of the sheath, so the side that'll be outward when you're wearing it, because I want to make sure all the holes line up with my scribe line. I'm not really too worried about the back lining up, but I've actually had really good luck with it lining up. It's certainly not perfect, but very happy with it. And because of the fold-over construction of the sheath, I've kind of had to drill in at an angle to get that to line up right. Okay, so before I sew it up, I'm actually going to put in the top rivet here on the mouth of the sheath that'll kind of hold together the this reinforced area. I got some copper rivets from Tandy. So I got the rivet and the burr, which is the little washer. Okay, so I got a 9/64 drill bit, and then I'll be using that to go through the leather here. Okay, so I just realized that I've got these copper rivets that are 1/2 inch long, and it's actually the exact length of my 4 pieces of leather here. It's actually 6 pieces of leather total stacked up, and so that's not long enough to go all the way through and rivet over. So, so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to put 2 rivets on either side of the mouth, because I also realized that I forgot to stitch the mouth of the sheath there like the historic examples have. So I'm just going to put 2 rivets on either side, because right now it's also a pretty tight fit at the mouth. So we'll just do that slight modification, and I think this will work out. Okay, so I got the rivet in on this side, so now I'm going to do this other side, and I'll show you guys how I do that. So we got the rivet and then the washer. So I'll run the rivet through the hole that I already drilled, then we'll set the washer over, and it doesn't fit all the way down, and so that's why I've got the setting tool. It's got a hole and then a dish. So we'll put the hole on there. I'm using a 2x4 instead of a regular metal hammer, because you want to use a dead blow hammer. I don't have one, but I don't have a small enough mallet either, so that's why I'm using the 2x4. And so once that's down like that, we will cut it off with the diagonal cutters. And then we'll use the dish side of the riveter. And we'll hammer that down. Okay, so that kind of mushrooms over the copper post there, and then I'll take a little ball peen hammer and just sort of smooth it up the rest of the way. Okay, so there we go. We got the 2 rivets on either side of the mouth. So you can see this is, I didn't rip this up, this is just where the glue didn't stick, so that's why I was able to do that. So this kind of leaves the mouth open, so it's either to get the knife in there, because it's a pretty tight fit. I didn't leave enough room width-wise for the sheath, but now we can go ahead and we'll start sewing this up. Okay, so to sew it up, we're back to the bank line again. I usually find that having 3 times the length of what you want to sew, because of the way the mouth is constructed with the welt ending right there, and then having this kind of open piece, That's where I'm going to start the stitching. I'm going to use it to hide the end of the knot here. We'll start the stitch here, right in the middle. So that way the knot, I'll hide the knot inside of the welt, and you won't even know it's there. So going through this first row of stitches is pretty easy. That's when you go back the second time that I'm going to probably have to use the pliers to get it through. But there's a lot of stitches on this knife, so I won't submit you to watching me sew this whole thing up. Okay, so I got the last stitch pulled through here, and now I'll just double back the way I came. And then we'll have the whole sheath will be double stitched. And so with that one length of cord although already in there, it can be kind of tough to pull through sometimes. So I'll use my Leatherman pliers to pull that up, and then I'll just use a piece of scrap leather to keep from scratching up the actual leather sheath. Alright, this is going to be the last stitch. Now I'll go back down one. Okay, now we'll tie that off. Shove that into the welt to hide the knot. Okay, we'll take it back over to the burnishing wheel, and we'll burnish up the edge now. Okay, so just like with the belt loop, I'm gonna go over first with a coat of water. So I'm just gonna wet the edge with some warm water. And I've got a slightly bigger wheel here, so it'll encompass the entire sheath. So beveling the edges like I did earlier helps to keep the edges from mushrooming over as I'm doing this. And you can see how where I've gone over it's nice and slick. So once I'm done with the water, I'll get my beeswax and we'll put a coat of wax on there. You can see how that wax sinks in there, and it does have a waxy feel, so that'll help repel water and all that stuff too. Okay, so I got all the edges burnished up, and so I'm just going to take my edge beveler tool, and because of the rounded sides, I'm just going to kind of slick everything up with this as well, especially on the edges. Because all of this edge slicking can be done by hand, there's different tools. The heat from the friction of rubbing this tool back and forth
is helping to just melt the wax into all the little edges and crevices and stuff like that. And that's what I want to do, is just melt all that wax in. Yeah, it's looking pretty nice. Nice and slick. Okay, so since the historic examples had a rivet at the top and then 3 more rivets down the side, I'm going to do that with mine. I'm going to keep using my copper rivets because that's what I got. The historic ones actually used pewter. So I'm going to go ahead and drill out my holes, and I got to keep it pretty close to the stitches because I want to make sure I go through the welt, so I don't want it to rub up against the blade. Put our first one in here. And then again, here's a look at the dishing section. Drop that on there. Here we go. With those rivets in there, it's really compressing the sheath, especially starting from this point. So that's, you know, with the edge of that washer. So this knife is really stiff in here. Like, it's ridiculous. So, which a stiff sheath is okay with leather because it's going to break in with time. So if it starts out tight, it'll break in, instead of if it starts out good, it'll just get sloppy. But right now, this is just too tight. Clearly, it's ridiculous. But so I'm going to wet down this back of the sheath here, and then we'll clamp it up, and hopefully that will give me some slack in here. Just gonna go over this whole back portion here. So again, I've got some scrap leather just so that I don't leave the indents from the clamps in the leather. And we'll just leave this like this for a few hours and we'll check on it. I still got a few more coats of linseed oil that I want to put on here, so we're not completely done just yet. Okay, we'll let this dry and we'll get back with you. Alright, here's what the finished sheath looks like. The trick with the water and the clamps worked out quite nicely. The knife comes out of the scabbard a lot easier now. There's still a little bit of resistance at the throat of the sheath. You can see right about there, it gets a little bit stiffer to go in, but that way it sheathes nice and solid. It's also retained well. I can shake it upside down and it doesn't fall out. Just by holding the sheath, it just feels like one solid piece. So I'm actually really happy with the fit on this. It will break in a little bit over time. So I did put a few more coats of linseed on there, and then I finished it up with some Red Wing leather conditioner, so got a real nice look to it. So on the historic D-guard buoys in the Milledgeville Arsenal, they were actually issued with belts, so they were meant to be worn, you know, kind of like you would think of a gun belt for a pistol. They would have a belt that this knife would be worn on, basically as a sidearm over the exterior of all their clothing. So you could do that with this knife, or wear it on your everyday pants belt. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I know it's a little bit longer than what I usually do, but I appreciate you coming along for the ride and listening to me ramble on about knife making. If you think you want to own this knife or one of my other custom blades, check out my Etsy web store. There's going to be links in the description box. As always, I appreciate the support. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. You'll get more knife making videos and short films. So thanks for watching, and until next time, be more Viking.